present you Gregory Clark.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to first talk about is the background to the current projects that I have. And this really starts with my book from 2007, which was A Brief Economic History of the World. And what the nice thing about this book is you could encapsulate world history in one picture. And this picture was one where for 10,000 years, there's no improvement in material human living conditions. And then within the last 250 years, the Industrial Revolution, and then the great divergence between successful economies and unsuccessful ones. And the great puzzle in this book was why the incredibly long delay in the Industrial Revolution. The institutional basis that would have allowed an Industrial Revolution existed 5,000 years before the actual Industrial Revolution. And so the question again was why was this event so long delayed? And the argument of the book was that before 1800, all societies were Malthusian. The average man and woman had 2 surviving children. But these societies were also Darwinian. A select group of people produced many more than 2 surviving children, and most people produced less. And we can see that in England from 1250 to 1800, but it turns out it's true of many other pre-industrial societies, and subsequent studies have actually also revealed that this is a correct characterization. And the important thing is that in these stable, institutionally stable societies, in this pre-industrial period, reproductive success was very closely associated with economic success. And in England, in say 1600, the most successful men had more than 4 surviving children, and the least successful men had less than 2. And so you're really seeing this kind of generation by generation, this selective pressure on the population. And at the same time, the argument of the book is we can actually see very clear changes in economic characteristics of individuals. The most dramatic of these is the long-run decline in the underlying rate of interest in society. In the Middle Ages in Europe, 10% was the return on secure assets like land. By 1800, that had dropped to about 4%. And so, as I say, preceding the Industrial Revolution, you do see this evolution of behavior. And so then the last interesting question is, if social status is social status strongly inherited, and is it genetically determined? And if those factors are correct, then the pre-industrial history of societies will leave an imprint in the modern world. And people will be kind of, in some ways, in modern societies, inseparable from their 10,000-year histories as societies. And so one thing, for example, that we find in Asia is that Chinese laborers were exported all across a lot of other much younger societies in Asia in the colonial period. In all of those societies, those descendants of those Chinese laborers have become the business class within those societies. There seems to be something about the history of China that is, even now in modern economic competition, leading to some differential success in business. And so as I say, so that's the interesting question, is how strongly is status inherited, and to what extent is that inheritance actually driven by genetics? So the conventional views on status inheritance are that this is actually mainly transmitted by social mechanisms, that it's often weakly inherited, and that social institutions play a very significant role in determining what that strength of inheritance is. And even further, amongst geneticists, there's a strong belief that a lot of genetic influences actually are operating through something called genetic nurture. That is, the parent influences the outcomes of the child largely by the kind of environment that the parent creates for the child. And so this is a kind of an indirect form of genetic transmission because the child shares genetics with the parent, but it's actually being influenced mainly by the social environment that the parent is creating. And we can see this in an example here of parent-child earnings correlations from the last 20 years, where you see that the intergenerational correlation is very different across different societies. It's very low for Nordic society. In Nordic societies, only about 10% of the variance of earnings is actually explained by inheritance. And so 90% comes from somewhere else. But in a society like Brazil, almost 40% of that will be explained by inheritance. And so this variation across societies, to some people, is suggesting very strongly that it's a social construct that determines inheritance, and it's a function of the social institutions of societies. So that was the first book and the puzzle that remained. And so then I wrote the second book in 2014, which actually used surnames to measure the strength of status inheritance across societies, and that measure could be extended all the way back till the Middle Ages. And the other thing that it does is it makes the measurement of status inheritance independent of all kinds of measurement errors. By looking at people at the groupings at surname level, you can effectively reduce that error component to 0, and you can actually see what the underlying inheritance of status is, where normally when we're trying to measure status inheritance, so for education, we use number of years of education. That's an incredibly noisy measure, right? It doesn't distinguish between different types of education, different schools. And, but by turning to this kind of surname level, we could then actually observe in all of these societies, including Sweden, what the underlying inheritance of status is. And the interesting thing is, when you switch to surnames, you discover that the intergenerational correlation of status is something close to 0.75. It hasn't changed in England from the medieval period till the modern. It's the same in Sweden as it is in England. It's the same in Sweden now as it was 200 years ago. And it turns out in Sweden, for example, people who went to college in the 18th century would often drop their patronym and take a Latinized version of their name. We can trace the descendants of these people to modern Sweden. 200 years later, they're still 3 or 4 times more likely to be an attorney or a doctor than is the average Swede. It's showing that there's actually a very strong underlying persistence in status, even in somewhere like Sweden. And so, as I say, so this book had this interesting finding that underlying correlations are actually very strong. And so that takes me to today. And so now I'm working on a third book that's nearing completion. And the running title is The Inheritance of Social Status. I did have a much better title, but that caused my lecture at Glasgow University to be cancelled by an outrage petition by 100 of the faculty. And so I have to retreat from, it was a clever title, but that you cannot joke about. For whom the bell curve tolls. Yeah. You know, genetics and social status. But that, as I say, you cannot joke about these things, particularly in America, right? And so this new book is based on 2 large databases that have taken many years to assemble. And both of these assembled with Neil Cummins, my collaborator in London. And so the first is a genealogical database of 424,000 people in England who are all linked into families. 3/4 of the data was derived from this strange British society, the Guild of One-Name Studies. And it combines genealogical data with social status measures. And with lineages, there's always this selectivity issue, which is it tends to be collected by middle-class people. Records are much better for upper-class people back in previous generations. It excludes people who do not leave descendants. And often there's not much social status information that's recorded. The advantage of the Guild of One-Name Studies is that they take an oath to follow everyone who has a particular surname, whether they left descendants or didn't leave descendants. And so you get, actually, if they follow everyone, then you're actually going to get a kind of an unbiased lineage. And the Guild, as I say, has 2,400 members and is tracking 8,000 individual surnames in England. These are rare surnames. So, for example, the guy who studied the name Argyll had been spending 20 years on that study and supplied, I think, a file that was 10 megabytes of information about everyone who had that name. And amazingly, in this database, I am actually colleagues to one of the people who's in the database in Davis. And in the cemetery there are buried some of the people who actually are in this database, including an Argyll. And the Guild, as I say, has this wonderful, used to have this wonderfully inspirational page on the web. The journey starts with one name. And this is a sample of this database, and you can see, because of large family sizes in the pre-industrial period, it's a very rich kind of set of connections between people that exist in the database. And from that, here's the number of relationship pairs we observe, and we have both kind of general lineages, people of average status, and then we have a bunch of elite lineages, people of unusually high status. So, for example, the database has almost 1.5 million pairs of fourth cousins, right? And 1.4 million third cousins. And so you actually end up with this very elaborate set of interconnections in this data. And what we've done, spent a lot of time on, is adding social outcomes here. So for people who are currently alive, for a lot of them, we know what the value of their house is, what's the local neighborhood they're living is like in terms of a generalized index of deprivation, which is what's education levels, what's crime levels, what are social benefit levels in the neighborhood. And we also know if they're a director of a public company. And then historically, we know the wealth at death of practically most people after 1800, whether they were probated or not, what their adult occupation was only for men, whether they had a professional qualification, what their literacy at marriage was up till 1889. From the censuses, what were they doing ages 10 to 18? Were they at school or at work? What's their longevity? So we actually get a lot of social information then on these people. And then we have a second database, again formed with Neil, which records the details of 1.7 million marriages in England from 1837 till 2022. And that gives the occupations of the groom, the bride, the father, and the father-in-law, the ages of the groom and the bride, and the literacy of the groom and the bride. And that's been assembled by a group of anarchist genealogists, the Free Rag organization, who hate the paid subscription genealogy websites, and so they seek to make public these records, which are actually held, the master of these records are all held by the government and are very hard to get access to. And this is an example of a marriage certificate from 1838. You can see the fathers, the occupation of the fathers. You can see whether people are literate or not. You can see their ages, the date, the location. The British government is still using that same, essentially that same wedding certificate. So it still records, even to today, the occupations of fathers and the occupations of the parties getting married. And they must have something like 110 million records of marriages in England since 1837. But as I say, they're very hard to get access to other than through Free Rag. Okay, what do we find with this database? The first thing we find is that there's a very strong persistence of underlying social status across multiple generations. And if we put a number to that, there's almost a 0.8 correlation between a single parent and a child in underlying social status, however way we measure that social status, measured by occupation, measured by education, measured by literacy. There's this strong underlying transmission of status. The second surprising thing is that that correlation is exactly the same all the way from 1600 till now. the kind of dramatic change in social support, in education provision, the modern welfare state has not in any way changed the strength of transmission from parent to child of underlying social status. And so, and as I say, these two conclusions are independent of any consideration of the mechanism of transmission. But one thing it does say is there's very strong inheritance, and that inheritance has not been changed by these other means. And also, this inheritance is very consistent with the surname studies in terms of the strength of that inheritance. You're finding very similar numbers by looking at people by surname classes as opposed to by looking here at individuals. But the really surprising thing in this data is that these correlations between relatives going up to fourth cousins are still quite significant, and it's very consistent with a very simple model of additive genetic transmission with strong genetic assortment of people in marriage. This will actually fit all the data. So this is a model with two parameters that is sufficient to describe English kind of intergenerational transmission of status over 400 years, right? And so this is, as I say, a surprising model. So that's been published recently, and so if you want the details, there's a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with this result. What we can do is, there was a result generated by Fisher in 1918, which tells us what the correlation between any two people in a genealogy will be in terms of their social outcomes if it's transmitted through additive genetic means. And so we can actually calculate for any two people what this correlation will be. And as I say, it depends just on h squared, the heritability of the trait, m, the partner genetic correlation, and r, the partner phenotype correlation. But r and m are related through h squared, so that's why there's actually only two parameters in the model. And then all we need to do then is calculate for all of these people what are the correlations by genetic distance. And just to make sure that this is not being driven by some unobserved kind of connection of all people in the data, we actually can construct, or I construct, a set of deliberately unrelated individuals and look at what the correlation in outcomes is between them. And that number always comes in as indistinguishable from 0, right? So there's nothing inherent in the data that's somehow driving these correlations. But as I say, for fourth cousins, most of these correlations are significantly higher than 0. And if you have a fourth cousin, that implies that you had a common ancestor 150 years ago. Most people have no knowledge of who their fourth cousins are, and probably very little social interaction with their fourth cousins. And it's equivalent if you went from parent to child, of going 9 steps down a genealogy, right? And so this is actually, as I say, surprisingly strong linkage of people to those who are distantly connected to them. And what we can then do is we can graph here what's the implied shared genotype of people. And you can see that without assortative mating, siblings would have a 0.5 correlation in genotype, but it's actually going to be 0.8 with this level of assortment in marriage. And even fourth cousins will end up still having a significant shared genotype. And then we can just plot the curve here. And as I say, what you find is that for all of the different aspects of status that we can look at, you essentially get the same diagram, where it's very strongly predicted by the implied genetic correlation between any two relatives, okay? And as I say, and then the unrelated is down here at 0. And so this is for people who are, I need to go backwards. This is for people who are currently alive in Britain. We can alternately go to the period where people were born 1780 to 1859, and this is male occupational status. And the interesting thing is that these coefficients are essentially the same, right? For the early 19th century, and now we're looking at people who had a common ancestor back in the 17th century, if we're looking at fourth cousins or third cousins. And as I say, the astonishing thing is just how consistent this data is. And one of the things is that if these correlations across parent and child were declining in the modern world, then what we actually observe with this data is if we take the log of the correlation and then the number of steps away you are in the lineage, you find that that forms a straight line. If what was happening was that the correlation was declining for more recent generations, you would find a curved line here, right? Because the cousin correlation would drop a lot, but then the second cousin less and the third cousin less, because earlier on there were stronger correlations than they are now. And so this is actually telling us, when you look at fourth cousins, something about the archaeology of social status inheritance. And it's saying it had to be consistent across all of those generations in order to get us to the point we're observing now in the year 2000. Okay? And so that's saying basically from 1800 to 2000, there's no change going on. Sorry, going back. This is not any proof of causation, right? All we're observing here are correlations. There could be other things that are driving this that are independent of genetics. But I'm going to show you a lot more evidence that the social world really has the strong consistency with genetic transmission and direct genetic transmission being the source of these correlations. As I say, if it's not genetics, what it's also, though, telling us is something about the nature of the social world. Because what it would say is any successful social model of transmission here would have to, in some sense, echo the facts that you're finding here, right? It would have to be a method of social transmission that would somehow produce the appropriate sibling correlations, cousin correlations, and other correlations, and would have to actually look very much in character like genetic transmission, but it might have some completely independent social source. So the one thing we know is that there's a surprising regularity to the nature of status transmission. So what additionally do we gain from the marriage records? What we can actually do from the marriage records is actually estimate what the phenotype correlation in underlying status is of grooms and brides in marriage. Because by looking at the correlation of the groom to their own father versus their correlation to the father-in-law, we can actually get an estimate of how closely the bride-groom matching is actually occurring, assuming that it's a symmetrical transmission of status from father-in-law to bride and father to groom. And the number that emerges from that is that the occupational status correlation in marriage is 0.8. And this strong phenotype correlation can easily explain the predicted 0.57 genotype correlation. And it implies this very strong heritability of social status of 0.73. And what this is actually saying is that when we look at most measures of how much people correlate in marriage, it's rare that it's above 0.5, right? So for years of education, it might be 0.4, 0.5. But what this is saying is when people were matching, even in 19th century England, when women had no formal occupations, they somehow were seeking a partner who had some kind of level of social competence. And they had much more information about the character and qualities of their partner than we as kind of social science investigators get from these very crude measures. And they somehow, and so this is this very interesting social fact, somehow people in these societies wanted to make a match that's very strongly based on matching your social status here. That was the thing that seemed to matter to them. And that's actually then what's driving this very slow underlying social mobility and the very high levels of persistence. It's this very strong matching that you're actually observing in marriage. And so one other interesting issue that comes up is this a new characteristic of certain societies? If we go to hunter-gatherer societies, for example, would we find similar types of matching? Or is this actually something that emerged only, say, later than the Middle Ages in societies like Europe or in China? And one of the consequences of this, by the way, is that it widens enormously, whatever the mechanism of inheritance is, it widens enormously the distribution of abilities in a society. The tighter these correlations are in marriage, but that'll take many generations. It'll take something like 600 years for that to have full effect. And so another interesting possibility then for the Industrial Revolution would be, was there a kind of a development of highly assortative marriage, which also was having this effect of widening distribution of abilities, and then the Industrial Revolution could be driven by the innovators who constitute the kind of top 1 or 2% of these populations. So as I say, this is interesting. It's consistent with the other mechanisms. And the book in construction is going to have many other tests of whether the transmission of status is indeed by additive genetics. So one strong prediction there would be gender symmetry. A second one is that birth order should not matter to people's social outcomes. A third one is things like parental age should not matter, family size should not matter, parental death in childhood should also be largely irrelevant. And then also that you would see a kind of linearity in transmission, that the top of the distribution, the transmission there would look very similar to the bottom of the distribution. And you wouldn't see kind of a different rate of status persistence at the top 1% that you see at the bottom 1%. In terms of gender symmetry, what we can do is here we can look at, say, the literacy of mothers versus fathers, and what's the correlation of that with the literacy of their children in the 19th century. And you can see that they're essentially indistinguishable. The lines show the 5% confidence interval for these estimates. And for higher education and occupational status and wealth, what we look at is the paternal grandfather versus the maternal grandfather, and what's their relative predictive ability for grandchild outcomes. And what you can see is that for higher education and occupational status, there's no distinction, right? The maternal line and the paternal line are equally important. For wealth, there is a very big distinction. It's the paternal line that matters. But wealth is the one thing that we don't observe this kind of transmission between generations, right? Because wealth is something physically transmitted for wealthier families. And there you see that social influences actually become quite important. And so we do see that symmetry. We can also look at maternal versus paternal uncles, what their occupational rank is, and what that then predicts about the outcomes for their nieces and nephews. And you can see again that there is actually a nice symmetry here between the paternal line of the family and the maternal line. They're contributing equally in terms of information about the outcomes for children. As I say, there is this strong belief now in genetic nurture. And so the idea here is the parent genotype can influence the child outcomes through a direct pathway, through the child genotype, but also through an indirect pathway from parental social outcomes towards child social outcomes. And there have been various attempts to demonstrate this looking at people's genetics. All of those attempts, though, run into difficulties if there is a strong assortative mating. A lot of them, the results that people are seeing can be produced without genetic nurture as long as there's strong assortative mating. But what we can do with the database here is we can look at sons whose father died before they were 14, whose father died when they were a teenager, or whose father lived until they were at least 21. And then we can ask, well, what's the correlation between these different classes of fathers and the sons? And what you find is that if you look at the data, there's a very slight effect that actually knowing your father increased the correlation. It's not statistically significant, right? And basically it's saying a father will be just as correlated with a son, even though another father may well have taken their place, or else the household doesn't have a father, right? And I haven't distinguished, we could also distinguish between those two variants. But it is interesting that it doesn't seem to matter what happened to your father in terms of how strongly correlated your outcomes are with that father. What about birth order effects? If we look within families, looking at modern data, you can see that for most of these outcomes, this is measured in standard deviation units, the estimated effect of another step in birth order is less than 2% of a standard deviation, but almost all of them are insignificantly different from 0, right? And that's interesting contrast here because there is a famous study in Norway which finds much more significant birth order effects. But I'll say I have a PhD student now, so one of the things I was hoping that he could actually do is see if we can get Danish data and see, is that Norway outcome really correct, okay? Because it can't be, these societies are not sufficiently different that both of these results can actually be correct. One of them's got to be wrong, okay? And then this is going back to the period before 1929. This is for average status lineages from sons who were number either 1 or to 10 in birth order. This is their social occupational status outcome. You can see there's absolutely no effect of birth order on these outcomes. If we go to middle status families, again, no effect. You can't see it in the data here, but there is actually some effect for very high status families. For the top 1% of the distribution, there is some effect of birth order on outcomes. Last of all, I wanted to talk about, there's a challenge to these results. There's a paper that came out exactly the same within months of this paper, which actually, if we look at this, the abstract here, has this very clever way of looking at extended kin within Sweden, in modern Sweden, and does actually identify that assortative matching has to be very, very strong to explain the pattern of correlations, but concludes that genetic influences cannot explain this sorting, and it's primarily non-genetic factors that are actually driving this. And so, and how did they identify in-laws here? So the married are identified as people who parent the same child, which is identified in the register data. And then by linking them to the parents, we get identification of brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law, and they go across as many as 5 marriages. And the results in 141 different types of relative, including people who are 5 marriages apart. And then they look at the outcomes in terms of, and one we'll look at here is years of education and then income and height for men. And as I say, this is how you proceed with the linking. So they're looking just 3 generations deep, but up to 5 marriages across in terms of their data. And they find very strong persistence of educational status. They find there must be a sorting and partnering very strongly, but they rule out genetic mechanisms. And here's the pattern of correlation, and here's the model that they fit to it, which is the predicted is the dark dots, and the observed is the light dots. And so they fit a very complicated model to this data. These are the 5 equations, the structural equations, and includes observed and latent variables, and they fit it with 20 unknown parameters. And so, as I say, it's hard to know exactly how much insight there is once you have kind of such a complicated model. And then they also fit a genetic transmission model, and you can see with this model, there's a big gap between the actual outcomes and the predicted outcomes, which is why they say we can actually reject this genetic transmission model. But what's actually happening is I'm working with Martin Christensen, who's here, who's a PhD student, and we are looking at kind of re-estimating the Swedish data, and then hopefully going on to actually collect very similar data from Denmark, so to have another body of data to test this on. And what we want to do then is to actually calculate, using very similar modeling to the English lineage data, what the correlation should be with genetic transmission between, and this is a brother-in-law to I don't even know how you describe this relationship. So this is the brother of a husband who's married to a wife, who has a sister, who has a husband, and then this is looking at the correlation between that brother and the sister on the other side here, right? And it turns out that you can build up, here's the correlations we expect at each juncture here, and so you can build up to an estimated correlation, again, with a kind of simple genetic model and assortment occurring in marriage. And this is very preliminary, so nothing here is cast in stone. We have to think carefully about, are we doing this correctly? Do we have the right parameters here? And then we can also, as I say, go from an uncle to a daughter to a husband to a sister. And we can get then an equivalent table of expected sets of correlations where you're looking at these affine relationships. And then we can fit these models in logs. And what does the fit look like? It turns out that the estimated value of R for the Swedish data is 0.795. Remember, in the English data it was 0.785, right? The estimated intergenerational correlation, the estimated B here, it's 0.745. I think in the English data it was about 0.78. And then M is a bit lower, but it's estimated with a confidence interval here. And so it was 0.57 for England. It's 0.49 here. And what does that fit look like? It turns out the R squared of that fit is 0.946. There is some inability here to fit like the father and mother-child relationship. And if I look at the data, I can see why that's not happening. So we have to think about why the fit is not so good here. But down here, the fit is generally excellent. And so the interesting thing here is that you actually, this data will not reject even this is a simple genetic model that has 2 parameters. And it will actually fit the data. And then if you look at the alternative fit with the 20 parameters, the R squared is 0.956 in that case. And there are still some inabilities to fit some of the data down here. And so, as I say, the interesting feature is that there's nothing compelling in the modern kind of Nordic data that's saying that genetic transmission cannot actually be very significant here. And one of the things that's very clear in the Collado paper, by the way, is the persistence of status across these affine relationships is much, much stronger than would be expected in any of the conventional estimates of intergenerational persistence in somewhere like Sweden, right? And it is actually implying that there is actually astonishingly strong persistence of status in these societies, and that you will have sets of upper-class Swedes, lower-class Swedes, middle-class Swedes, and that these people are going to persist for many, many years in terms of these characteristics. And so the conclusion then, as I say, it's impossible to rule out genetic transmission of outcomes even in modern Nordic countries. So in other words, work with Paul Sharp, who's not here, he's currently in Greenland, we hope to also create a kind of a Danish lineage study that would be comparable to this Families of England study for England, to explore also the history and mechanisms of social mobility in Denmark, going back potentially 200 years. So as I say, nothing is convincingly shown here, but it is surprising the power of very simple genetic transmission mechanisms to explain a lot of the social life that we're observing around us. Thank you. So, questions? Yep.
First of all, I love your work. I think it's great. I'm curious about I don't know if this works, differentiating between the purely genetic impact versus the genetic impact through environment, right? And going back to the father dying, it seems like there could be other environmental impacts at play, right? The mom is still alive. You could have a sort of mating with the next husband. And so I'm curious if you have considered looking at adoption studies to like buttress this work.
Very good question. What will happen, though, is you can actually predict that if mom marries a second husband, you can predict what the relationship of that second husband to the first husband will be. And I think the correlation between the two of them is only going to be something like r squared, right? And so there will be a lower correlation of the child to that second father. And so you would be able potentially to detect a decline in the correlation with the first father if the transmission is really through the characteristics of the second father, right? And then we'll get a second class. Now, in the data, we could actually see each of these circumstances. We'll get a second class where the father's just not replaced, okay? And so again, we could actually see, is there a difference in terms of the correlation in that case compared to the correlation in this case? Now, in terms of adoption, I mean, that's interesting. It would, again, for Martin, I keep thinking up things he should be exploring urgently. Sweden has good data on adoptions. And one thing that might be interesting to apply is the Collado et al. Model, because if they believe that there's only social transmission, it should have very strong predictions for what the outcome should be for adopted children. And there's pretty good evidence that adopted children very weakly inherit the characteristics of their adoptive parents. For things like IQ, there's actually no inheritance for adopted children, for adopted parents, once they're adults. There is correlation when they're children, but that correlation declines over time. In England, I think there's almost no adoption in English society. And in fact, I don't think there's a legal form of adoption until the 1920s in England. And so we actually don't see kind of in the data many formal adoptions. People live with other people, but they're not actually formally adopted in English society. And the sign of that is they would retain their father's name. Even when there's a new father in the household, it's actually quite rare for them to adopt the surname of the father. But I agree that we might be possible to do kind of more interesting things. What we can also do is look at the influence of grandparents, and they are also predictive of child outcomes, but then we can distinguish dead and living grandparents. They're equivalent. There's no difference. We can distinguish grandparents that live 200 kilometers away from grandparents who live next door. There's no difference. They're all predictive, right? It's true of uncles as well. And so all of these relatives help predict outcomes. But in no case is there evidence that you ever have to meet one of your relatives for them to have for that to change the predictive influence. Thank you. Go ahead.
I would just like to ask you to confirm or disconfirm two conclusions I'm making in my mind, listening to what you just said, as to whether two other supposedly significant events in human history are not relevant at all. The first is that evolutionary biologists habitually point out that one of the special things about our species is that parents will sometimes interfere with the mating choices of their children. This is not seen in other species, not in gorillas, not in chimpanzees, etc., etc. That pattern was supposedly widespread during most of the feudal period. And jumping from there to Goethe's book, The Sufferings of the Young Werther, the translation of that book was banned in many countries, including Denmark, partly because it was seen as inspiring a wave of suicide, but also because the message was that young people should make their own mate choices for themselves. The parents should not interfere. That was part of the message. But it seems that this change of the right to make decisions didn't affect the overall social pattern at all, if your data is correct.
Sure.
That's rather interesting, I think. I'm just trying to link it to.
Sure.
Second, what I thought was the fact is the hypothesis first predicted or advanced in Great Britain by sociologist Michael Young, who wrote this book about the meritocracy, the rise of meritocracy in Britain.
Yep.
He predicted that heritability would grow to 1, essentially.
Right.
If we made, if social mobility was promoted. And I thought that the book, the bell curve sort of confirmed, or thought to be confirming that picture. But you're telling us that this hasn't really changed at all.
Yes.
That's the overall point.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So just taking the second point first. Yeah, I know there was all of this feeling that basically, yes, if you move to a society that's based on merit, then you could actually have this perverse effect where you actually drive up inheritance as a source of people's position. The amazing thing in England is there's just absolutely no sign that we've changed that thing. And I think what it is saying is, surprisingly, in pre-industrial England, it's a surprisingly meritocratic society. People have a very false image. And let me give you one example. The Huguenots arrived in Britain in the 1680s, and they were about 1% of the population. And they arrived without capital, but with tradition of education. They quickly assimilated into English society, and you can see that by the first names of their children, and also the women they married were non-French surnames. By 1800, they had a 30 times higher chance of going to Oxford or Cambridge than the average person in Britain, right? So this is a complete set of outsiders who actually originally had a different religion, who become completely embedded in the English upper classes. And then a lot of the elites of England now, and it's still the case that people of Huguenot descent are something like 4 or 5 times more likely to go to Oxford and Cambridge than the average person in England, right? Again, showing persistence. And so I think, as I say, that we just have a false impression of how non-meritocratic early societies were. And then the second thing was, yes, what about parents controlling marriage? And we actually, this is an issue that comes up when we try and measure assortment in marriage, because if it's really driven by the parents, the assortment of the children will be much less, right? Because the parents are going to look at their own characteristics. If they're matching families, the children are going to deviate to some degree from those characteristics, and so you'll actually get less assortment if it's the parents who are doing the matching, particularly when the women are young, right? But what actually happened for most families in England is women didn't get married till their mid-20s. Most of them had already left the family household years before, independently earned and kept that money. And so I think there's just a lot more independence of parents for most people in these societies. And then the second thing is that we can actually, in the data, there are some cases where the parents need to consent for the marriage to occur. If either party is under 21, we can look at the characteristics of those marriages as opposed to ones where, for example, both parties have married before. Or we can look at cases where the father is dead, right? So that there isn't matching. We don't see any difference in the quality of the matching in that case. And so as far as we can tell, it's also the case that people behaved in a much more modern way in choosing marital partners, at least back as far as the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an intriguing talk. I have a background in medical science, and I was just interested to hear your opinion on two things. One is you say genetics. What do you think? What kind of characteristics of phenotype do you think the genes are operating through? What are the downstream effects of these genes? That's question one. Right. And the second question is, does your result imply that it's the same genetic factors being beneficial 200 years ago for your social status as it is today?
Now, I have to be very, it turns out that, modern understanding of genetics is really just at a kind of statistical level, right? So they can infer with these GWAS studies locations on the genome which are statistically associated with outcomes, but often they have very little idea about what exactly is happening here. It's just kind of a statistical association. My impression of the way societies function is that essentially it's exactly the same characteristics 300 years ago that made someone socially successful as the ones we have now, and that the nature of social life has really not changed across that interval. I mean, even when we had, community society where half the people are farmers, the things that make you a good farmer as opposed to a bad farmer are very similar to the things that make you a good professor at SDU as opposed to a bad professor. And a lot of it's driven by kind of drive. There's some intelligence that people need. There's some flexibility, some ingenuity. And as I say, what is very interesting is that for some reason, as I say, it's puzzling that for some reason, people wanted to match up on those characteristics, because we could imagine a society where all that men cared about was the physical attractiveness of a spouse, right? Or all women cared about was the height of a male partner, right? Which would produce, as I say, much more social mobility, very different kind of social order, very different distribution of abilities within the society. And so I thought, well, this is a kind of, so this is really a kind of sociogenetic analysis of how the world works, but it's a combination of genetic transmission plus this very interesting social fact. But then someone pointed out to me that no, in this pre-industrial world, if social success then drives reproductive success, there'll actually be a selection mechanism by which people who choose to partner in that way will produce also more offspring and will come to kind of dominate the population over the long run, if it really is the case that there's this strong gradient between social success and reproductive success. And again, it could be just hardwired that this is how people evaluate marital partners. Thank you.
So thank you for your very intriguing talk. I was thinking about the slide you showed where the correlation between parental income in the Nordic countries was lower than it was in Chile, which seems to show that social policy in the Nordics have influence on heritability of income. How could that fit with this seemingly strong and inflexible result that you have? And what are the implications for a society that strives towards equality when you have this seemingly genetic and intrinsic effect?
Very good question. So what happens is, if you look at America in contrast to to Denmark or Sweden, what you find in a society like America is that highly educated people earn a lot more than people with less education, right? And so a bus driver and a surgeon in the United States have enormous differences in their incomes. In Nordic society, this has all been compressed. There's much less dispersion. And so what it means then is that someone's income in the United States is a very strong indicator of their social position. But in somewhere like Denmark, it's actually quite a weak indicator of what their actual social position is. And so it's really just saying there's a lot more noise attached to income in a society like Denmark than there is to in a society like the United States or Chile, right? Which again has much wider distribution. And then the other thing that's interesting is, if you look at a society like the United States or Chile, there's a much wider range of social groups that have come together in those societies. So Chile has a significant indigenous population. It has populations that came from various European countries. Within a society like Denmark, you've got potentially much less variation in terms of people's social aptitudes. And there's also selection effects with migration, which are sometimes positive and sometimes significantly negative. And so, as I say, it's the thing is, it's just harder to detect what underlying rates of social mobility are in a society like Sweden or Denmark. But as I say, when we switch to the kind of the surname level, then we see that, hold on, if you take people with kind of noble surnames in Sweden, They're all living still in high status neighborhoods of Stockholm. They have higher taxable income. And this is 200 or 300 years after that status was created. And it is again implying that there really is still this very significant persistence despite the kind of egalitarian nature of the society. Now, I'm not in any sense saying that egalitarianism is bad. I think it's a wonderful feature of these societies that they've kept these things compressed, particularly if people's social outcomes just come from some unmerited inheritance of some kind of genetics. And so I think it's actually, it's a nice thing that, and that it would be nicer in America if we could compress these distributions, but it just makes it very difficult then to compare societies in terms of, well, does one have more social mobility than another? Because the measures we're getting are very difficult. This shows up, by the way, if you just take raw occupational status correlations in England. In 1800, it's 0.7 between father and son. By 1980, it's only something like 0.3. And so you might be then tempted to conclude, oh, we did enormously increase the rate of social mobility. It just turns out it's very much harder to actually measure occupational status recently than it was in the 19th century. A third of people in the 19th century are laborers, and we know exactly what a laborer corresponded to. A third of them are large, not a third of them, a chunk of them are large farmers or, blacksmiths, other kind of occupations. When we go to modern occupational data, you'll find something like 20% of people are managers of some type. But manager can include manager of a cafeteria, manager of a hot dog stand, manager of Apple, and it turns out it's actually modern occupational descriptions. It's very hard to actually sort out what the actual status of occupations are. And so that's why it's very dangerous to ever compare kind of occupational mobility rates or intergenerational mobility rates across different societies because of these measurement problems that always rise. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. My question is very related to what you just asked, right? Because when you were presenting the English data, I was thinking to myself, okay, surely in the Nordic countries, this is going to be different, right? I mean, the hypothesis being that the role of this genetic transmission on some social dimensions like occupation or years of education or level of education is going to be moderated by the specific social context, right? By the fact that here in the Nordic country, like in Denmark, I'm coming from Spain and I was living in the US, and when you explain to people outside Denmark that people here not only don't pay to, for studying, plus they get money for doing it. So when you present the data now about in relation to Sweden, that you can see that if I understood correctly, that the role of genetic transmission is still important. Isn't it kind of depressing for these kind of societies here, where there's all these initiatives made to promote social mobility, as I understand it, but at the same time you can still see that the role of genetic transmission is so important? So
as I say, what we're doing looking at Sweden is still very preliminary. Yeah. What I would say is the data is certainly much more compatible with genetic transmission than the authors of the Collado paper would say. And then this is actually a puzzling, I find puzzling feature, which is there's a general horror at the idea of genetic transmission of features. Now, one thing is, we know that height is genetically transmitted now in societies, and no one seems to be particularly upset about the fact that short people and tall people actually are produced by kind of genetic means. I just think of it as, two things. One is there's a lot of lottery elements to life, and that's just one of the elements of that lottery that we're unable to take away. The other thing is that people who worry about genetic determinism should realize that even with a heritability of 0.75, 50% of all outcomes for people are unpredictable, right? And so it's still the case that there's enormous random, now it turns out this is just pure randomness, right? But it's still the case that even then, you're not going to be able to look at some child and say, I know what your outcome is going to be. It does, though, turn out that if we look at groups of people, when we take away that variation, then we can say, I know on average what these outcomes are going to be. So one of the things I depress my students by telling them is that just by being at college, I can predict that for all of, on average, their children will be less successful than you are. And it's just a feature of regression to the mean, right? And it's actually just, again, an interesting feature of the social world that the very wealthy and the very privileged cannot protect the position of their children, right? And as I say, we don't understand that in terms of social outcomes because they have so much money and so much access to privilege in many ways. But we do understand it in terms of genetic mechanisms, that there has to be regression to the mean. And so in some sense, what I'm saying is it's a kind of fairer world than you might expect. The wealthiest, the most privileged in the society, they're the ones whose children are going to move down most in terms of social outcomes. They'll still do better than average, right? The people in the bottom 10%, they're the ones who have the greatest prospect of improvement for their children. And so I'm not depressed. I think this is fine that we live in such a natural world.
Just a small follow-up
Right.
on that. Isn't it so that heritability about the variation around the mean, usually here in education? So one comforting thing about the Nordic country could be that if we move the mean up a lot, that would not be visible in a heritability analysis because you start taking the mean out and look at the variation around the mean.
So the question here was, well, maybe we shouldn't worry about relative status. We should worry about absolute status and moving everyone up. Another part of the book, which there's another chapter planned, which Christian, the research assistant, is working on. There's actually very little evidence that extensions to education actually had any impact in terms of making people more productive or making them better agents. And we can look at events where societies had an increase of 1 year in compulsory schooling, and then look at the people who just got the benefit of that reform versus the people who didn't. And it turns out there's lots of cases where there's absolutely no effect from these changes, right? And the weird thing is, so a recent paper came out that said that this is the case in Britain for reforms in 1946. But then they concluded, well, that's because when they gave people an extra year of education, they gave them in terrible British schools. There was another paper that showed there was no effect of another year of education in Germany, but the explanation then was that's because German schools are so good that you've learned everything you need to know long before compulsory education ends. And so as I say, the interesting thing is the one thing that we can add is more years of education to everyone. There's surprisingly little evidence that that actually makes people more effective economic agents. Okay.
Thank you, Greg. Very fascinating and puzzling set of studies. And I agree with you. There's nothing depressing necessarily about these findings, although I would point out that, regression to the mean over many generations at a speed of 0.7 something, 7.7, 7.8, it's pretty slow, right?
Yes.
That said, I fully also agree.
So what that says, in 300 years, your descendants will be absolutely average.
Right. So that's a very slow speed, I would argue. But okay, that said, I wonder, I'm a simple political scientist. And I agree with you, of course, that, a 2-factor model is better than a 20-factor model, Colado and so on. But what's happening in this transmission? So what is happening with the matching? Really, now I'm trying to pull out your sociological, because you've given us some clues, but not many. What is really happening 200 years ago in the class society of Britain when a young after 21, young 25-year-old
Right.
men with a women. So this matching, what can people do when they meet each other? Secondly, the transmission. Yeah? What is it that's being transmitted? Going back to Cora's point, is it the same genes? Is it something like a dynastic memory or culture of success? What are your hunches? Because you've been very parsimonious on those.
Oh, again, it's a good question. You know, I'm not privy to what chit-chat people engaged in when they were courting in 1837, right? All we can observe, though, is what does the correlation of a groom look like to his father compared to his father-in-law? And the interesting thing is, if there was zero correlation in marriage, there should be zero correlation with the father-in-law. If there's very high correlation in marriage, there's going to be very high correlation with father-in-law, and grooms' father-in-laws are very similar to their fathers, right? And so that's all we observe empirically, is there's some process going on here where you really stay very close in terms of kind of the social realm, okay? And my interpretation is that, you know, if I think about, you know, how did I get married? There are certain qualities that you appreciate in a spouse, right? My spouse spends a lot of time telling me I'm an idiot. And they're a very educated person. And so just kind of imaginatively, something like this, I think, is happening even in these earlier societies, that people had certain qualities they would look for in a partner, right? And people getting married in this time expect to have lots of children. You want a spouse, if it's a woman, who's going to manage the household well, who conserve resources, who's healthy, who will take care of children. If you're a woman, you want a spouse who's not going to drink away all of the earnings, who will be a reliable, regular earner. And so, you know, I mean, I think these are the things people have, in some sense, always wanted in partners. But I have no special insight into why that type of marriage predominated and when it came to predominate. One thing that I haven't done that would be an interesting test is, because we have the ages of partners here, it would be to look at what happens when you get very mismatched ages in marriage. Do you then observe that they're not following this rule, right? Because age could be a proxy for attractiveness in the wife. And in those cases, when the husband is 10 years older than the wife, do you then observe a breakdown in the social matching? So there might be some interesting clues within there, but you know, there are certain limits to what we can know about the social world. And also, as I say, there are these amazing limits where we know from twin studies the strong genetic influences on social outcomes, but we have very, very little insight into what exactly makes someone genetically successful in the social world. Thank you.